Zombies. We've seen them all over pop culture, in movies, in games, in comic books, but are they real? You're probably sitting there laughing at the screen.
No.
But what I'm about to share with you all today paints a completely different story. You guys will not want to miss today's episode. In 1936, celebrated African-American author Zora Neale Hurston was afforded the research opportunity of a lifetime. With support from New York City's prestigious Guggenheim Foundation, she was able to travel to Haiti, where she investigated the religious practice of voodoo among the island nation's population. Now, this was how Zora saw something rarely ever experienced by outsiders. She met a woman still alive, but nearly 3 decades after she had died. Even more shocking, it seems as if this woman just one among hundreds, if not thousands of other Haitians who have returned to life over the centuries. A Dr. Lurks Beneath, director general of a hospital in the town of Gonaves, introduced Zora to the mysterious woman on November 9th, 1936. When she visited the hospital yard that day, Zora found the patient named Tell simply staring at her dinner as if she didn't know what to do with it. Well, as it turns out, this behavior was completely consistent with the story that Dr. Leon had shared about her reemergence from the grave only 1 month earlier. Now, in many ways, Felicia Felix's mentor's story begins, or depending on your perspective, ended decades earlier. The daughter of a farmer, Felicia and her husband had managed a small grocery store for years in the village of Ennery in Haiti's Artibonite region. It wasn't much, but it was enough to support themselves and their sole child, a son aged between 2 and 3. Now, in 1907, however, Felicia suddenly fell ill and unfortunately passed away. Would it be appropriate at this point to say bye, Felicia? Anyway, after her burial, her husband and son mourned her, but eventually they would move on, as we all must, and the father remarried and the child grew up to be an adult man. Now, it wasn't until 29 years after she had been placed in her grave that Felicia
came back from the dead.
In October of 1936, a disoriented woman, naked and alone, appeared on the road leading to Felicia's father's farm. Authorities, of course, were immediately notified. Now, when the woman appeared at the property, she began speaking in a dull voice, telling the farmhands, "No, this is the farm of my father. I used to live here." Everyone tried to shoo her away, but she kept insisting that the property belonged to her family. Unable to rid themselves of the intruder, the workers fetched the farm's owner, hoping that he could drive away this insane trespasser. Well, when the boss arrived, he was astounded to find that the woman was, in fact, exactly who she claimed to be. He had no doubt, after all, the farm's new proprietor was Felicia's own brother. Now, Felicia was whisked away to the hospital, her brother astounded to find her alive after all these years. I mean, after all, he had seen with his very own eyes how she had been laid to rest in 1907. Yet here in 1936, she seemed very much alive, if not physically well. Upon her arrival at the hospital, Felicia's ex-husband was summoned to help identify her. Now, at first, he refused. Following his wife's death, he had taken up a position with the government and feared that acknowledging such superstitions might affect his reputation. Now, eventually, Dr. Leon and other officials compelled his involvement. When her husband arrived at the hospital, he was shocked as everyone else. Felicia had not left, but as a matter of fact, Felicia Felix's mentor had actually survived. Now, sitting in the hospital yard, one of America's most famous authors was staring at the same woman. Zora Neale Hurston described Felicia's eyelids as white as if they had been burned with acid. Her expression, a blank face with dead eyes. Later, Zora would ask in her 1938 book, Tell Me My Horse, how did this woman, supposedly dead for 29 years, come to be wandering naked on a road? Nobody will tell who knows. As Zora Zora approached Felicia that day, the woman reflexively retreated. Without warning, she snapped a limb off a shrub and began making a point of working, dusting off the nearby fence and table. She seemed skittish, afraid that she would be viciously beaten if she wasn't seen keeping herself busy. Now, it was during this brief meeting that Zora Neale Hurston was able to snap a picture of the woman. To this day, it is one of the few, perhaps the only photographs of an actual zombie. Listen, I understand this sounds completely fiction, but let's be clear. Zombies are 100% real. Their authenticity is beyond debate. However, the reality is not quite like what we've been conditioned to expect in pop culture. You see, our modern media landscape is saturated with the undead, right? Human corpses reanimated by everything from genetic tampering or viral outbreaks, Resident Evil, and extraterrestrial intervention. The zombie genre now has a whole list of do's and don'ts, items to be checked off whenever crafting a good narrative. They eat human flesh, headshots are the only surefire way to put them down. I mean, their bites will turn you into the living undead, and of course the list goes on and on and on. Modern fictional zombies might even possess superhuman speed or a degree of intelligence their earliest depictions lacked. Now, this is not what we are talking about. Today, we're discussing an older, stranger, legitimately real phenomenon where human beings appear dead only to be kept alive. These victims are exhumed from their graves and forced to toil for years as indentured servants, like Felicia, but beyond the broadest strokes of the dead walking again, very little of our modern ideas actually come from reality behind zombies. Authentic zombies, including their namesake, come from the Haitian voodoo tradition, although it should be noted that their creation plays no role in the actual practice of the faith. Zora Neale Hurston once wrote that discussion of these zombies in Haiti seeps over the country like a cold current of cold air. Zombies were simply a fact of life. Her account of Felicia is one of the first times that the outside world actually learned about real zombies. Unfortunately, she was written off as being overly superstitious at the time, perhaps because she was an African woman. Now, it wasn't until 1959 that researchers outside of Haiti began taking the topic seriously. In fact, that year, anthropologist Alfred Matreau released his landmark book, Voodoo in Haiti. Now, throughout his career, Matreau had earned overwhelming respect both for his academic work and his efforts as a human rights leader. Therefore, it came as a surprise when, much to everyone's shock, he claimed that magical practitioners in the island nation were capable of reanimating human corpses. Matreau wrote that there existed people whose decrease has been duly recorded and whose burial has been witnessed, but who are found in few years later in a state of verging on idiocy. He added that in the sophisticated capital of Port-au-Prince, there are few, even among the uneducated, who do not give some credence to these macabre stories. As evidence, although secondhand, Matreau cited the story of a young woman in a small town who had become ill and passed away. Now, in the days, weeks, and months after, she had fallen deeply in love with a young man and actually became engaged. This enraged a local houngan, one of the male voodoo priests who had also found her quite attractive, but whose advances the girl had rejected. So fueled by anger and unrequited love, the houngan vowed to take revenge one way or another. Now, the girl languished in her illness before finally passing away in the hospital. Her body was delivered back to her family for funeral arrangements. Unfortunately, the coffin that they had acquired was just a bit too small, so she had to be bent a little when she was interred. To add insult to injury, a careless funeral attendee accidentally dropped a cigarette in the coffin at the ceremony, leaving a small burn on the foot of the poor girl's corpse. No more than 3 months after her burial, the girl's family was shocked to learn that their own daughter had been seen around town. She was spotted in the company of her spurned lover, the houngan. No one believed the rumors at first because it wasn't until several years had passed that they would actually learn the truth. Authority structures in Haiti, particularly the church, often carried out campaigns against ritual belief in the country. These included efforts to suppress pratique superstitiouses, or superstitious practices, as they call them, among the population. It was during one of these anti-superstition campaigns that the Houndgan of our story had a change of heart, repented in his sorcerous ways, and released all these zombies he had ever enslaved over the years. Among them was the young girl. She arrived on her family's doorstep after years of being presumed dead. As proof, her neck was bent and her foot still showed a scar where the still burning cigarette had been dropped onto her body at the funeral. Although she did lived for long afterward, she was never her old self again, instead remaining dull and far from sane. Her story strikingly resembles Felicia Felix Mentor's. Now, Alfred Matrot was one of the first intellectuals to lend actual credence to the reality of reanimating the dead. This isn't to say that the idea was entirely foreign to those outside of Haiti, however. The island's zombie tradition itself, perhaps imported from the African continent, was well known before Matrot brought these stories to the English-speaking world. Now, similar ideas of the living dead appeared in earlier works of fiction, from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein to the early 20th century. Zombies had also appeared here and there in motion pictures, but it wasn't really until George Romero's 1968 smash hit, we've all seen it, ladies and gentlemen, Night of the Living Dead, a classic, by the way, that the word zombie would become a real household term, even if the word itself was never used in film. And by film, I mean specifically the 1968 film. Now, within 10 years of Alfred Matrot's book, the idea had leapt from relative obscurity to an academic curiosity to a horror cliche. Few actually viewed the idea of zombies as anything other than fiction. I mean, can you blame them? Few entertain the idea that the dead could actually be made to walk again. Evidence suggests that zombies are real, even if they aren't exactly what we expect them to be. Now, the pop culture image, as we've spoken about, of the zombie has drifted far from its Haitian roots. Unlike in modern stories, true zombies are not created by a virus or anything like that. They are generated through a combination of pharmacology and religious belief. Now, whenever a malicious magician creates a zombie, the dead return as stiff, shambling shadows of their former selves, lacking all free will and instead doomed to serve their masters for their remaining days. They aren't freed by a headshot. They are only truly freed when the sorcerer releases them or if they are fed salt. Although if not given enough, salt only sends their zombification into temporary remission. Now, to truly understand Haitian zombie tradition, we must go back to the old world. The theme of resurrecting the dead as mindless hordes is shockingly ancient. In the Mesopotamian text, Descent of Ishtar, the titular goddess warns, "If you do not open the gate for me to come in, I shall smash the door and shatter the bolt. I shall smash the doorpost and overturn the doors. I shall rise up the dead, and they shall eat the living, and the dead shall outnumber the living." Note to self, do not piss off Ishtar. Now, Ishtar's threat is echoed again in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which dates as far back as 2100 BC. Perhaps from this precedent, notions of reanimating the dead spread out into Europe, Asia, and continental Africa. It was claimed that Greco-Roman magicians who specialized in necromancy not only communicated with the dead, but allegedly possessed the power to raise them bodily from the grave. However, the corpses which classical necromancers raised from the dead were not just soulless husks. They had the same intellect they had in life. They might even be smarter, returning with wisdom from the afterlife. I mean, zombies, on the other hand, are mindless servants restored solely in body rather than both in mind and body. Now, this variation might have originated in spiritual practices from Africa. Some scholars point to similarities between the word zombie and terms from Central Africa. The words nzambi and zumbi. In the Kikongo language, these mean God, spirit, or fetish. No, not that kind of fetish. Come on, guys, get your mind out of the gutter. In anthropology, a fetish is an inanimate object that is believed to be inhabited by a spirit. However, few African beliefs point to the bodily resurrection of the dead. Notable exceptions can be found in places like South Africa, where some believe that witches can kill, resurrect, and enslave people. Instead, most African beliefs suggest that zombies take place on a spiritual level. Some cases are almost indistinguishable from what we would call spiritual possession in the West, while in other examples, there's really no body involved at all. Evil magicians simply capture the victim's souls to do their evil bidding. Now, this zombie variation is equally common in Haiti, where it is referred to as zombie astral. It is believed that souls hover above corpses for 7 days after death, during which time they are especially vulnerable to being captured by a sorcerer. Now, from that point forward, the owner of the dead person's soul can command it to do anything it wishes, including harming the living. Now, these sorcerers might be houndgans, as mentioned in the story Alfred Matreau shared, but just as often were Bakers. Now, Bakers are Haitian voodoo witches for hire who dabble in both light and dark magic. Quick note here, by the way, that voodoo and vodou are actually the same thing, they're just different pronunciations. Or should I say, different accepted pronunciations. So going back to Bakers, think of them as warlock mercenaries. It is the Baker who is predominantly responsible for creating Haitian zombies as we know them, as mindless drones created from the dead who serve their masters, performing manual labor like working in the fields or even digging holes in ditches. Now, for years, the exact scientific mechanism by which zombies were created does remain a mystery, but the secret recipe, which we'll get to in a little while, was revealed in the 1980s. Now, prior to that revelation, Haitians simply had to believe what little bits and pieces they heard whispered throughout their communities. It was commonly held that the method for creating a zombie went something like this. Bakers visit fresh burials under the cover of darkness, offering appeals to Baron Semedi, the god or Loa of graveyards and the dead. The Bokar and his assistants, perhaps zombies themselves, pick out a grave, placing and lighting white candles at the foot. If the grave has a cross, it is draped with the symbols of Baron, a silk top hat and a frock coat. If there is no cross present, the Baker quickly fashions one. A ritual is performed to summon this Baron, who lets his presence be known by flapping of the coat and hat. The Loa then receives offerings of the money, food, and beverages from the grave robbers before they send Baron back to the sleep using magical herbs. The Bokar and his assistants then exhume the chosen corpse. One of their number asks the dead body a series of questions, the answers to which are never heard by anyone else. The dead comes alive, but completely lacks free will. Maybe this is what happens, maybe not. Haitians didn't need to know how zombies were made, they just knew that they existed and sought any number of methods to prevent their dead loved ones from suffering such a fate. Some decapitated bodies or stabbed them through the heart prior to burial. Sorry about that. Others left a dagger in the coffin for the deceased to kill the Bokar before they can be taken. In fact, another method involved tossing seeds into the coffin. It is believed that the Bokar would be compelled to count them before beginning the zombification process. The hope was that the Bokar would become so preoccupied with this obsessive task that he would let daylight creep up on him and the ensuing dawn would frighten him away. Dark magic cannot abide sunlight. Now, by 1864, zombie belief had become so widespread in Haiti that Article 246 of the country's penal code read, "Also shall be qualified as attempted murder the employment which may be made of any person of substance which, without causing actual death, produce a lethargic coma more or less prolonged. If after the administering of such substances the person has been buried, the act shall be considered murder, no matter what result follows." This legal language hints at the reality behind how zombies are actually created. While we can't rule out literal magic, I mean, this is what lurks beneath, after all, it is clear today that, at least in some cases, a pharmacological component is at play. This likelihood is reinforced by the fact that, surprisingly, it seems possible to reverse zombification. In 1980, a Haitian man named Clervius Narcisse returned to his family 18 years after dying. According to the story, in the spring of 1962, Narcisse had arrived at his local hospital, spitting up blood and complaining of a fever. A pair of doctors, one Haitian and one American, declared him dead on May 2nd. He was buried the following day near his village, and 10 days later, a concrete memorial slab would cover his plot. Yet, somehow in 1980, Clervius Narcisse simply walked back into the village market and introduced himself to his sister using a boyhood nickname only the family knew. Clervius began sharing bits and pieces of his story. His brother, angered by a land dispute, had apparently hired a boker to kill and resurrect him. Within days, he was dug up from his grave, bound and beaten, and taken north, where he labored on a sugar plantation alongside other zombies for 2 years. Now, eventually, one of his fellow zombies snapped, killing their master, and now freed, the former slaves dispersed into the countryside, slowly stumbling out of the spell that they had been placed under. Now, Clervius, afraid that his brother was still alive, remained in the north, trying to reach his family through the post. Unfortunately, all of his correspondence was returned. Only after learning of his brother's death 16 years after did he dare to return home. Now, tragically, his sisters believed that he should have stayed dead and refused to relinquish the family land. Clearly, the story of Clervius Narcisse indicates that real zombies do not truly die. And this is exactly what fascinated Wade Davis. Now, Wade Davis is a Canadian cultural anthropologist and ethnobotanist who catapulted to fame in 1985 with the release of his best-selling book, The Serpent and the Rainbow. Sounds like a metal album, which details his name in Haiti. Seriously, apparently it's a really good book. Over the course of several months, Wade embarked on a dangerous study of the Houngans and Bokers' methods, learning their secrets with the careful eye of a scientist. Eventually, he determined exactly how zombies were made. As it turns out, zombies in the Haitian tradition indeed never fully die. They are simply made to appear dead through the very careful dosage of highly toxic drugs administered orally or through an open wound. The substance is none other than tetrodotoxin, or TTX, the poison found in pufferfish. In fact, one single pufferfish contains enough TTX to kill a lot of people. Well, 30 to be exact. However, administered in the most minuscule amounts, TTX can induce other effects. Just one tiny drop can bring vital signs so low that even doctors can't tell whether the poison victim is alive or dead. Bodies paralyze, eyes glaze over, organs will fail to respond. Terrifyingly though, the brain remains lucid and very active. The afflicted person remains in this state for days before either dying or, like the Haitian zombies, recovering. Now, Wade Davis had made a miraculous discovery, but this possibility was actually hinted at for millennia, thousands of miles away. And for 2,300 years, people in Japan have consumed a delicacy known as fugu, a dish prepared from pufferfish. Now, fugu has the potential to kill the consumer unless it is prepared with extreme care. In fact, modern chefs must go through a lengthy 2 to 3 year, not month, year training course just to prepare this one dish safely. Only 35% of applicants pass. Talk about being a chef that makes some killer food. But those who succeed are legally authorized to offer a delicacy fetching hundreds of dollars per serving. The allure of fugu is partially because it's risky. I mean, many people have died from eating fugu, and partially because there remains just enough TTX to get you high, leaving your head light and your body tingling. Now, combining his knowledge of chemistry and ethnography, Wade Davis unlocked the mechanism by which Haitian Bokers created zombies. Through careful study, he determined the exact components of the dangerous mixture sorcerers gave their victims. Now, in Haiti, the first ingredient is harvested after allowing a poisonous cane toad and a sea snake to kill each other in a jar. Cane toads relieve bufatoxin, hallucinogenic in small amounts, fatal in large enough doses. To this added ground millipedes, tarantulas, and various seeds and plants, some of which cause additional negative effects like pulmonary swelling and dermatitis. The concoction is then buried underground for 2 days, after which even more ingredients are then added, various leaves and bits of plants, including members of the stinging nettle family. The nettles almost act like tiny syringes to deliver the zombie poison. Still more plants render the recipient unable to speak, if the poisonous mixture is, of course, consumed. This hellish substance is complete only after the Boker adds the skins of white tree frogs, more ground tarantulas, a second cane toad, and finally, TTX from the pufferfish. Geez, what is this, Halloween? This sounds like a witch's brew. Now, to seal the deal on the spiritual level, garnish with ground powder from human skulls. Seriously, guys, this might be a hit for your next Halloween party. After dosing the victim, the Boker simply has to wait until after their funeral, then dig them up when their vital signs start to return. This is helped by the fact that many burials in Haiti are not in the earth, but rather in above ground tombs. Once their tomb is opened, the victim is drugged further using a combination of sweet potato, cane sugar, and datura, inducing hallucinations. In this highly susceptible state, the zombie is given a new name and charged with a life of labor in the service of his or her new master. Wade Davis's discovery revealed how zombies were created, but one question bugged him: why does zombification stretch into years and years? I mean, after all, the effects of the initial TTX dose eventually wear off, right? Well, Wade came to a startling conclusion. While this pharmacological cocktail made people into zombies, what kept them zombies was magic, or more accurately, belief. Although these two things might not be as distinct as we would like them to be. In short, Wade speculated that the superstitions of zombie belief in the Haitian culture are so powerful that they keep zombified people in a state of subservience and impede free will long after the effects of TTX wear off. A TLDR version for you is that it's the placebo effect. Again, we're splitting hairs here. Depending on your perspective, there is actual magic at work because magic and belief are so closely entwined. Viewed another way, maybe bringing these soon-to-be zombified so close to death serves to loosen the bonds between the body and soul. In this very vulnerable state, the near-dead allow sorcerers to capture their souls, which is the true source of their power. Either way, through this technique, their victims are turned into lifetime laborers, toiling in the hot Haitian sun day after day, never fully aware that they can break free from their own imprisonment. However, as Zora Neale Hurston wrote, zombies are wanted for more uses besides field work. For instance, there is some evidence that true zombies might also function as personal servants. Alfred Matreau told another story, one about a wealthy Port-au-Prince man, we'll call him Monsieur Peterson, who was traveling to another town when he noticed his car had a flat tire. Peterson pulled off at the nearest village to repair it, but before he can even attend to the damage, an old man sporting a white goatee appeared out of nowhere offering to help. Someone else, he said, would attend to the flat tire. Won't you please join me for a cup of coffee? As Monsieur Peterson and the man walked together, the mysterious stranger confessed not only that he was a powerful Hungan, but that he had orchestrated the flat tire. Please don't hold it against me. When they finally sat down for that cup of coffee, the Hungan explained that he did so because Peterson's car contained something special, a wanga, a negative magical charm inside. Presumably, this was why he caused the tire to blow. Now, all this time, Monsieur Peterson remained dubious, irritating the Hungan. To prove his authenticity, Peterson's peculiar host offered proof. Did he happen to once know a Monsieur Celestin, a man who had died just 6 months ago? Peterson admitted that not only had he known Celestin, but that they in fact had been good friends. At that, the Hungan cracked a whip aside, whoosh, 6 times. A nearby door opens up and a man shuffles backward into the room. The Hungan demanded that the man turn around, lashing him for moving too slowly. As he did so, the servant revealed his face to Peterson. Now, to his shock, it was a dead ringer for Monsieur Celestin. His zombified friend reached for his glass, which Peterson was about to hand to him, until the Houndgan warned against it. Handing anything directly to a dead man carries bad luck, the Houndgan said. Just leave your glass on the table. Now, shocked, Monsieur Peterson did as he was told, now a true believer in the mysterious man's power. Celestin simply hung his head. He would have looked sad if he had any expression at all, but instead, he only bore the vacant countenance of a corpse. Now, before the two parted ways, the Houndgan told Peterson that it wasn't him, but another sorcerer who had caused his friend to die. Instead, the Houndgan had purchased Monsieur Celestin for a paltry cost of $12. While it seems like Wade Davis solved the mystery behind traditional Haitian zombies, a few questions still do linger. Are there actual examples of people who seem to have died and been reanimated? How many of these examples are medical? How many of these examples are paranormal? Before taking a closer look at all these possibilities, let's consider some examples throughout the non-human world where zombies are not merely fantasy, but rather a fact of life. Now, by far the most popular example would be that of Ophiucordyceps, or simply cordyceps, a fungus made famous by its appearance in the video game and HBO adaptation of The Last of Us. While many may think that the idea of fungus overtaking its host sounds like science fiction, well, the phenomenon is shockingly real. Over 200 species populate the Ophiucordyceps genus, with more being cataloged each and every day. While many interactions with fungus can be terrifying, a lot of them are toxic to human beings and animals. I mean, cordyceps carry their own unsettling secret. You see, cordyceps have evolved the ability to infect their victim's mind. These species of fungus use their spores to infect a host, then alter the insect's behavior to distribute their spores more efficiently. This is accomplished by taking over their host while it is still alive, growing into and out of their bodies until at last they die. In one example of this phenomenon, a species of cordyceps has evolved to infect, take over, and kill North American carpenter ants. After infection, the ants essentially become zombies. The ants climb as high as they can on elevated vegetation, affix themselves to the very top, and eventually die. The position at their death allows the spores to drift far in the wind. The fungus sprouts hideously from their bodies like fur. To be clear, this is not a minor takeover. Researchers have discovered that the cordyceps actually manage to take full control of the muscle fibers in the ants while they are still alive, forcing them to move exactly as it wishes. As Pennsylvania State University Associate Professor of Entomology and Biology, David Hughes said, "We found that a high percentage of the cells in a host were fungal cells. In essence, these manipulated animals were a fungus in ants' clothing." Want to be really freaked out? Something similar happens in human beings. And while it is much more subtle, there is a good chance that you are already infected. That's right, folks, you could be a zombie right now. According to estimates as of 2012, at least 22.5% of all Americans over the age of 12 have already been infected with Toxoplasma gondii, a microscopic parasite found in rodents. Infected rats and mice display a lessened fear of cats, which increases the odds that the pest will be eaten and move on to its next host, the felines themselves. Now, I'm not saying that we're eating cats here and getting it that way. What I am saying is the parasite replicates within cats and spreads through its feces, where it easily passes on to humans. In fact, some health organizations actually warn against pregnant women changing litter boxes, as toxoplasmosis infections can have a profound impact on fetal brain development. Even if you're not around cats, well, you're still at risk. Toxoplasmosis can also be contracted by the consumption of undercooked, contaminated meat. Studies have shown that the parasite manifests personality changes in us just as it does in rodents, although the effect is much less pronounced. Studies have shown a correlation between toxoplasmosis infection and a higher frequency of traffic accidents. Gee, wouldn't you know it? Road rage, schizophrenia, and even a slightly elevated risk for suicidal attempts. It's not all bad news, though. The changes brought about by the parasite also appeared to manifest in slight positive personality changes like extroversion and a tendency to be less conscientious. Some have even gone on as far as to speculate that the stereotype of the crazy cat lady actually finds its roots in toxoplasmosis infection. But returning to other zombies of the animal kingdom, a professor from Vancouver's University of British Columbia actually discovered in 2018 that a wasp found in the Ecuadorian Amazon also has the ability to create its own zombies, a necromancer insect. A zoologist by the name of Philippe Fernandez Fournier was well aware of the predatory relationship between Zetapoda wasps and communal Anolosmus eximius spiders. The wasps use spiders as host for the larvae, laying eggs inside their bodies. As each larva hatches, it begins consuming the flesh of the spider until the host is dead and the larva has matured. What Philippe wasn't aware of, however, was that the new species he discovered actually exhibited its own unique behavior. In addition to consuming its host, the larva actually takes control of the spider. He said, "This behavior modification is so hardcore, the wasp completely hijacks the spider's behavior and brain and makes it do something it would never do, like leave its nest and spinning a completely different structure. That's very dangerous for these tiny spiders. Wasps manipulating the behavior of spiders has been observed before, but not at a level as complex as this. Once the larva has control of its host, the spider becomes zombie-like, isolating itself from other spiders and fashioning a web that allows the larva to mature. Within this cocoon the spider has created solely for the wasp larva's benefit, the grub matures, emerges, and then finishes eating its host, growing into an adult wasp. Now at this point, it may seem like zombification is solely a risk in the animal kingdom, but plants are not immune. In 2014, British researchers discovered that a bacteria known as phytoplasma actually exerts similar control over flowering plants like goldenrods. An infected plant will not bloom with yellow flowers, but rather extend leaf-like appendages to attract more insects that the bacteria can infect. While it doesn't exactly kill the plants, researchers compared infected specimens to the living dead. Eventually, they only serve the spread of the bacteria. Let's return back to zombies, at least in the traditional sense. There are often other reasons why human beings might appear as reanimated corpses. Soon after Wade Davis's release of The Serpent and the Rainbow, researchers Siobhan Dayan and Roland Littlewood investigated reports of zombies in Haiti in the 1990s. It was their goal to find out if other medical conditions could possibly explain the phenomenon in addition to what Wade had discovered. The paper they published in The Lancet in 1997 examined only 3 reputable cases, but interestingly enough, each explanation differed from the method Wade described. In the first, a 30-year-old woman fell ill and quickly died shortly thereafter. She was buried the same day in the family tomb near her home, and 3 years after her death, a friend rediscovered her wandering aimlessly near her village. Family members, neighbors, and clergy were brought in to identify her, all of whom recognized her. Although she looked much thinner, she still bore a distinctive facial mark. When she was found, the woman was in shambles. She walked slowly and stiffly, hardly moved her arms, and kept her head low. She was unresponsive to any and all questions, and was only able to mutter incomprehensible answers. Dayan and Littlewood concluded that the woman suffered from catatonic schizophrenia, a condition that often manifests in the patient walking as if they are in a stupor. The condition is rare. However, this does beg the question of how she escaped her tomb. It was found to be empty, and there was a curious detail suggesting that she had been deliberately zombified. Her ex-husband, learning of an extramarital affair she had engaged in, had become jealous just prior to her death. We are left wondering if the husband hired a boker to execute Wade Davis's zombie method, and the woman was left with lasting psychological effects. Now, the second case Dayan and Littlewood described involves the eldest son of a policeman whom they referred to as WD. They wrote this: "When he was 18, he suddenly became ill with a fever. His eyes turned yellow, he smelled bad like death, and his body swelled up. Suspecting sorcery, his father asked his older brother to obtain advice from a bokar, but WD died after 3 days and was buried in a tomb on family land next to the house of a female cousin. The tomb was not, as was customary, watched that night. Now, 19 months later, WD reappeared at a nearby cockfight, recognized his father, and accused his uncle of zombifying him. He correctly recalled comments made by his family at the funeral. He was recognized as a zombie by the other villagers, the local Catholic priest, and the magistrate. His legs secured to a log to stop him wandering away. His uncle was arrested at his father's request and sentenced by the provincial court to life imprisonment for zombification, confessing that he had been jealous of his brother who had used his literacy to register all the family land in his own name. WD's father's story was supported by the villagers, the judges, and priest involved in the court case, the local coffin maker, and by examination of WD's death certificate and the proceedings of the uncle's trial. The uncle escaped from prison during the political turmoil of 1991. We traced him, and he agreed to do an interview in exchange for protection. He denied sorcery or poisoning, saying the case was a trick on the part of WD's father to expropriate his property entirely, and his confession had been induced through torture by the police. The female cousin denied involvement in WD's zombification, but refused to allow us to open the tomb on her land. When he was found, WD rarely spoke. When he did, he only used single words. While he maintained that he had been enslaved as a zombie, he was unable to describe his period of imprisonment. After examining this case, the researchers determined that WD not only had brain damage, but struggled with epilepsy. The additive effect of trauma rendered him zombie-like. And the third and final subject that they studied, Dayon and Littlewood, looked at the case of an 18-year-old girl. She had joined several friends to pray for someone else who had been zombified, only to find herself suddenly afflicted by diarrhea and a fever. She died 3 days later. The family immediately suspected that the bokar had learned of the girl's prayers and exacted his revenge. However, they didn't think she was just a zombie. They just assumed that an evil spell had killed their daughter. It wasn't until 13 years later that the girl, now a woman, was rediscovered in the town where she grew up. She now had a daughter suspected as the offspring between herself and another zombie, perhaps the bokar himself. According to what they gathered, the girl had been released from service when her bokar died and had walked 100 miles back home in the south. Dayon and Littlewood suspected that the girl simply and tragically suffered from a learning disability. This, coupled with a case of mistaken identity, led to her disappearance. They explained. With the patient's agreement, we took her to the area where she said she had been kept as a zombie. She was immediately recognized in the market as a local woman known to be Simple, who had been enticed away 9 months previously by a band of musicians during the Lenten Carnival. Both families now insisted that the girl was theirs and accused of other family zombification. The girl's daughter and brother then appeared, who closely resembled her in physical appearance, mannerisms, suggestibility, and minor learning disability. She recognized her daughter, whom she had previously named correctly to us, but she still insisted its father was a fellow zombie. The villagers said that she had been formerly married to a local man but were unable to locate him. The victim appeared to recognize her cousin as the bokar's son, but the villagers ridiculed the idea. In conclusion, Dayon and Littlewood wrote this: people with a chronic schizophrenic illness, brain damage, or a learning disability are not uncommonly met with wondering and Haiti, and they would be particularly likely to be identified as lacking volition and memory, which are characteristics of a zombie. Since Dayon and Littlewood's study, other possible causes for modern zombies have emerged. Among these is Cotard's syndrome, or Cotard's syndrome, a rare condition first described by French neurologist and psychologist Dr. Jules Cotard in 1882. In this terrifying mental disorder, sufferers believe that they have lost all of their internal organs or blood. In other instances, the patient may believe that they are dead, have lost their soul, or are convinced that they do not even exist at all. In a 2008 paper, researchers described one with Cotard's syndrome where the woman was convinced she was nothing less than the living dead, in other words, a zombie. They wrote this: Mrs. L, a 53-year-old Filipino woman, was admitted to the psychiatric unit when her family called 911 because the patient was complaining that she was dead, smelt like rotting flesh, and wanted to be taken to a morgue so that she could be with dead people. Upon interview in the hospital, the patient expressed fear that paramedics were trying to burn down the house where she was living with her cousin and her brother. She also admitted to hopelessness, low energy, decreased appetite, and somnolence. Thankfully, medical intervention improved the patient's condition. When she was stable enough, she was discharged and expressed not only hope for her future, but a commitment to participate in follow-up psychiatric care. In another 2014 paper examining cases of the same syndrome, a 65-year-old retired teacher with no history of family mental illness became convinced that his house was falling down around him and that his organs had stopped working, including his brain. A month before he was taken to the hospital, he tried to hang himself, but was fortunately saved. His motivation was that he believed he was spreading a deadly infection to the villagers who thought he might suffer from cancer. This was followed by a period of time where the teacher was convinced that he was dead. He refused to eat and lost a significant amount of weight. After the third suicide attempt, he was taken in for psychiatric care and recovered over a period of 7 weeks. In all the cases we have discussed thus far, no one has actually died and returned from the dead. But that is exactly what Swedish-born radiologist Anna Bagenholm did in May of 1999. For you see, Anna's case isn't remarkable for her return to life. These events happen every day and fall into the broader topic of what many call near-death experiences, or NDEs. No. Anna's case is remarkable for how long she remained dead and how low her body temperature dropped. 24 years ago, she was completing a residency in Narvik, Norway, when she decided to enjoy a routine skiing trip with her 2 friends in the Shun Mountains. At some point, Anna lost control of her descent. She tumbled down the mountainside, completely powerless to slow herself. All she could do was wait for her body to stop. When it did, she crashed into a frozen stream. The force of her body weight and momentum cracked the ice, and she plunged headfirst into a hole that she had created. The accident left her trapped beneath a layer of ice nearly 8 inches thick. The only thing protruding above the surface were her legs and her skis. 2 of Anna's friends arrived only moments later, immediately seized her by the feet. They tugged with all their might, and while the effort was enough to keep her from disappearing entirely underneath the ice, they were terrified to find out that no matter how hard they tried, they could not pull her out. Anna's clothes began soaking up more and more water, the weight slowly but surely dragging her deeper and deeper into the frigid stream. The only thing to be thankful for was that Anna had managed to find a pocket of air beneath the ice, which allowed her to remain conscious. Well, for a while, at least. After 7 minutes of attempting to rescue their friend, Anna's fellow skiers finally called for help on their phone. The minutes ticked by and Anna only grew colder and colder, her supply of oxygen quickly dwindling with each second passing. Rescuers finally arrived and began their effort. Even they took 8 minutes to extract Anna from her frozen tomb. Anna Bagenholm managed to hold onto consciousness for 40 minutes underneath the ice until she succumbed to circulatory arrest and blacked out. Now, above the surface, her complexion was as white as the snow that she rested upon. She was no longer breathing. Her blood had completely ceased circulating. The rescuers refused to give up hope. They rushed Anna to the nearest hospital, immediately took her to the operating room, where they began attempts to warm her blood outside the body, manually using a heart-lung bypass machine. While normally only used for the most intense surgeries, the device allowed the medical team to quickly raise the temperature of Anna's blood while hopefully limiting any complications. It was a long shot. The normal temperature of the human body is averaged at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. At the time she was admitted to the hospital, her body temp had plunged to a low of 56.7 degrees. Since hypothermia can even set in at 95 degrees, you guys can see the severity of the situation, and the odds of Anna recovering were alarmingly very slim. Within half an hour, technicians had raised the temperature of her blood to 87.8 degrees. As her internal temperature rose, Anna's heart began to recover, and after 3 hours of death, she managed to return to life, but remained unconscious for a dozen days until finally she awoke. While grateful to be alive, she found herself paralyzed from the neck down. She remained in the hospital for 6 weeks before she was discharged, having regained partial movement. Another 4 months of grueling rehabilitation followed, and after half a dozen years, she finally took to the slopes again. Now, how had this miraculous resurrection occurred? The best that physicians can figure is that the frigid temperature of the water essentially flash froze Anna. In this state, her brain needed far less oxygen in order to survive, and other biological processes were slowed in the process. The net effect meant that while her heart stopped and the oxygen supplied to her brain slowed, her brain was able to continue functioning in a semi-dormant state. At the time, Anna Bagenholm experienced the lowest recorded body temperature that anyone has ever survived. She still holds that record today, with one caveat. It is the lowest body temperature any adult has ever survived. You see, in 2010, another Swedish female, a 7-year-old girl named Stella Brentson, survived a temperature slightly lower than Anna's. It was just above 10 degrees Fahrenheit near Gothenburg, Sweden, when Stella wanted to embark on an imaginary treasure hunt just before Christmas. Her parents granted her permission to play outside, but soon became concerned when she failed to return home. And soon, Stella's parents and 20 of their neighbors were engaged in a search and rescue op for the girl. At the rear end of the house, a set of small footprints were discovered heading out into the snow in the direction of a steep cliff only about 100 feet away. Emergency services were contacted. Stella's father was already scrambling down the cliff, and from the appearance of her tracks, it looked like the girl had survived the fall, but staggered in the direction of the nearby shoreline. An MSN article described what happened next. Then came the call that Stella had been found. A chopper rescuer had spotted a pink jacket floating on the sea, and she had been plucked out of the water. In the helicopter, cardiac compression was started on Stella and continued all the way to the hospital 55 miles away. 20 minutes later, staff at the Queen Sylvia Children's Hospital in Gothenburg took over. At this point, Stella's body temp was just 55.4 degrees Fahrenheit, her heart had stopped, and she showed no signs of life. Her parents were told that the doctors would do what they could, but there was not much hope. The plan was to warm up Stella's body very slowly to about 89.6 degrees Fahrenheit. At 4 o'clock the next day, Stella showed the first sign of life. Her heart had begun to beat, explained her mother. Then 12 hours later came the next sign of life. She opened her eyes and closed them again, her father said. I've always thought that there are far worse things than death, but at that moment anything would be better than her death, even the possibility of her remaining in the hospital for the rest of her life. After 2 weeks, Stella finally began speaking. It took her a month to walk, followed by another month of physical therapy before Stella finally returned home. Today, she is very happy and very healthy. Stella's father told reporters they did it even though they thought she was dead, and in a way, she was. The boundary between the dead and the living is not crystal clear. So we know the history of actual zombies. They are people in Haiti who, through a combination of pharmacology and suggestibility, are rendered comatose by predatory folk magicians. We also know that other medical conditions, from trauma to Cotard syndrome, whatever you want to call it, can manifest zombie-like effects. We have also seen people have been returned from beyond the grave in the face of incredible odds. But are there any true zombies? People who have actually died and returned as living corpses? I mean, if you believe in the supernatural literature, the answer is maybe. Paranormal investigators run into their fair share of strangeness, but few expect to meet actual zombies. Yet that may be exactly what Chantel Apodaca encountered one winter night in San Francisco. Chantel was browsing a local metaphysical shop when the store clerk came out to greet her. Right away, she knew that something was off. His eyes were glassy, his movement seemed stiff and robotic. He had just looked up from reading a book about voodoo. Fastened to his belt were a series of crude brown dolls. Desperate to be polite and regain some sense of normalcy, Chantel inquired about the figures. The clerk barely mustered a response, grunting, "Good dolls." Chantel tried not to make it too obvious that she was heading to the door, but as she stepped outside, the clerk began chanting something under his breath, blowing a handful of mysterious powder into the air. She picked up the pace, not sure if she'd met a zombie or a houndkin who wanted to turn her into a zombie. The incident stayed in the back of her mind, but in the coming weeks, she didn't think that anything else would happen to her. That was when she had the vision. It felt as if she was wide awake, but since she was lying on her bed, she can't say for certain. Either way, everything certainly felt real as her bedroom closet slowly creaked open, revealing the store clerk inside. Now his eyes were coal black and he stared into her soul. The zombie clerk's gaze continued, freezing Chantel on her bed. She was now completely paralyzed, unable to even scream. Paranormal author Brad Steiger described what happened next. As she watched the zombie clerk in her closet, a maniacal look came upon his face. His chest cavity opened up. For a period of 5 minutes, his chest remained open and he stared down upon Chantel. After a few more moments, small black animal heads began staring out of the man's chest cavity. Chantel was confused and kept looking and wondering what these small animal black heads were. Then, to her revulsion, there was realization that they were the small black heads of rats. About 30 rats came out of the zombie clerk's chest. They started climbing onto the bed where she laid. They climbed all over her. She felt like they were gnawing on her. She felt like her skin was being torn apart. She tried to scream, but she couldn't. Her bed began shaking violently. Strange light beams came ripping through the walls, and the clerk started moving closer to her. His outstretched, scaly hands reached for her face. Now, when this thing finally lay his hand on her face, it felt as though he had ripped her face apart. When this happened, she was finally able to scream, and that moment passed out. When she awoke, everything seemed back to normal. It was broad daylight. To take her mind off what she had just seen or experienced, she began tidying up a bit, and that was when she found it, a tiny dead baby rat in her closet. So she screamed, unsure where the nightmare had ended and where reality began. While most real zombies seem to be of the slow, lumbering variety, one encounter in the summer of 1980 featured an undead visitor who seemed unnaturally fast. An English couple driving through Surrey noticed something in the bushes moving quickly enough to keep pace with the car. Even though they were only moving about 35 miles per hour, they were amazed and tried to figure out what it might be. The driver, the husband, kept looking out the passenger side, not wanting to chance taking his eyes off the road for too long, but nonetheless curious to determine what could be following them. At last, the underbrush cleared, revealing a human being. "Have you got your door locked?" the driver asked his wife calmly, yet with concern. "Yes," she whispered, not taking her eyes off the creature. "Is this some sort of maniac preparing to attack us?" she had wondered. But as she took in the details of their pursuer, she realized this could not be the case. Whatever it was wore a white one-piece garment. Long strands of hair flowed behind it as it ran, attached to the scalp to deathly pale flesh. There was no expression. To the contrary, the wife said that its face looked how she imagined a zombie might appear. Suddenly, the sprinting shape leapt for the door handle, trying to yank the car door open. Her husband, a trained aviator who had experienced his share of very tense moments in the sky, managed to keep his cool, depress the accelerator, and speed up to 45 miles per hour. Yet still the zombie kept its pace, matching their speed until at last they reached 50 miles an hour. At this point, the being stopped. In the side view mirror, the wife caught one final glimpse of their attacker as it slunk into the woods, disappearing into the bushes and the trees. She later learned that the road had seen more accidents than usual over the years and wondered if this strange presence was somehow to blame. Now, our final tale might not be a supernatural zombie, but it is no less disturbing. Paranormal personality John E. L. Tenney claims a lifetime of strange experiences, but few were quite as chilling as the zombie he met. Now, years ago, he became acquainted with a family of magical practitioners in Detroit, Michigan. In fact, he became very good friends with them, and they would often get together and share their thoughts on the most effective forms of magic. Over the years of their meetings, John was eventually gifted a silver coin from the matriarch of the family, who we'll call Mama Marie. Now, Marie was very serious when she handed it to John, warning him that it signified his soul. Anyone who had this coin had John's soul. They own you, so keep it in a safe place. Remember this detail, it's important for the end of our tale. Now, at any rate, John did as he was told, cherishing it as a special gift, but not thinking about it very often. His meetings with the family continued, where he began to notice some odd behavior. The family would drink frequently, oftentimes making jokes about one of their deceased family members. His name had been Lincoln, old husband to one of the family's aunts. Apparently, Lincoln had been a repugnant man when he was alive, mentally, physically, and emotionally abusing his wife. The family would brag about how they were still collecting insurance money from him long after he had died, and even lob insults at his memory. Much of their scorn was directed at a photograph of Lincoln clearly shown dead in his coffin. Well, late one night, Marie and John were drinking together when the old lady leaned into him and whispered, "Do you want to see Lincoln?" Now, John immediately thought that they had his body somewhere. He's dead, John said. He had no desire to see a decaying corpse in someone's basement or something along those lines. But Marie just smiled and responded, "Oh, he's dead, but he's not dead." Of course, John was intrigued. Within moments, they had driven to the parking lot of a local Detroit school. It was nearing midnight as the pair approached the back door. Once they arrived, Marie knocked forcefully, and they soon waited. And they waited. And soon enough, a tired custodian answered the door, looking unsurprised. He let both of them inside. Marie looked to the custodian and declared, "I'd like to see Lincoln." The custodian nodded, showing John and Marie to a small room, maybe a janitor's closet, where they waited. Now, at this point, John was very thoroughly confused. Why were they here to see a dead man? What did she mean by, "Oh, he's dead, but he's not dead"? John received his answer soon enough, although perhaps he wished he had not. He later remembered, "The guy that I thought had been deceased for so long comes kind of shambling toward us, slack-jawed, glassy-eyed, pushing a broom, nonverbal." Then Marie commands him to sit down. Lincoln trudged forward and flopped down heavily in a folding chair beside John and Marie. John said that Marie berated him for like 15 minutes before she decided they were done. The pair got up, returned to their car, John still in complete shock. On the way home, John knew what he had seen. Lincoln had been zombified. Somehow, some way. John's mind raced at the implications. They had faked his death, brain damaged him, somehow collected the insurance money, and continued to collect his paycheck. Now, apparently, from what John learned that night, Lincoln had an efficiency, a part that they paid for, was driven to and from work, and was kept well fed, but the rest of the money went back to the Marie family. Eventually, Marie broke the silence. She quietly said, "You know that coin I gave you?" She had asked John. John, of course, nodding, and then asked, "You know, I have Lincoln's coin. You still have your coin, don't you?" John said that he did, but that was the last time that he would ever spend time with Marie and her family. Now, to this day, John keeps his coin well hidden. More importantly, I want to know what you guys think. So be sure to drop your comments down below. I would love to hear from all of you. What do you guys think about zombies? Are they a legit thing, or is everything we talked about just completely discredited and should be thrown out the window? I'll leave it up for you guys to decide. But if you enjoyed today's episode, smack the living crap out of that like and subscribe button. And of course, I love you all. Keep an open mind, and I'll see you guys in the very next episode.